All right, we're going to be jumping into Genesis chapter 39, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to reshape and restructure our view of Joseph. Since the recording in Genesis 37 actually was several months ago, it was sometime late last year. We're actually at the tail end of April now, so probably wouldn't hurt too terribly much to get a little bit of review. But this story is easily one of those, I bet you're wondering how I wound up here type scenarios. The story of Joseph is about goats, coats, favoritism, and betrayal, and that's just in the early stages. We see much more to come into the latter Genesis narrative, and it's really a deep story. It's got a lot of facets, a lot of twists, turns. Kind of starting back to the beginning, Jacob favored Joseph over all the brothers and treated him as though he was the legitimate firstborn, which there could absolutely be a case made for him being Rachel's firstborn, of course, but Reuben was actually the first of them all, with Leah. You read a lot of the framework and patterns and in between the lines earlier in the book of Genesis. The whole thing with Leah actually could have been avoided and been a non-issue had Esau not had his whole wife situation going on earlier in the book of Genesis and spill the beans over to Jacob. Like I said, that's a lot of pattern recognition. That's a lot of framework that you have to really see between the lines of what's going on with the dynamic of the twins and also mother and father with Rebekah and with Isaac. But if you take a look, out of the 12 sons, Joseph was actually the 11th born. And it says that Jacob loved Joseph because he was the child of his old age. You know, it's one of those things, the funny thing about it all, he wasn't exactly a young man during the birth of Reuben, and furthermore, Benjamin was even younger than Joseph. So, who says the Bible couldn't be confusing, right? Now, the story in the background of the patriarchs does, like I said, it has a ton of twists, a lot of turns, and even on some of the more simple details, it's really hard to grasp because it can be pretty foggy. But regardless of who should or shouldn't have received the Bechor, the firstborn blessing, I do want to examine some of the facets and the topic of the father and son type relationship. Just for an example that you may be familiar with in my own case, if you know me and know my life, this will be kind of an added detail. When my wife and I, we had Gavin, our son, obviously our lineage extended. It wasn't just a single generation. It was now, quote unquote, two. It was a pair. And you could actually view that as like a partnership or collaboration. The word for father in Hebrew, it's one of the easiest ones to learn in my opinion, and simply because it's the very first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the Aleph, Bet. If you combine Aleph and Bet together, that's it. You have the word Av, you have father. The reason I bring that up is many people, you're familiar with the idea of letters and gematria. In gematria, it's just simply meaning that the letters hold a quantity or a numerical value. Well, Aleph, being the first letter of the alphabet, has a value of 1. You take a look at the letter Bet, that's the second letter of the alphabet, you probably could tell by that alone, yeah, its numeric value is 2. So it starts with 1, and then it goes to 2. It's the next step in the family lineage as extended. So it's a doubling, and it's a blessing. Now there's a curiosity to this word also, the word blessing. Because the word blessing in Hebrew, barak, it's comprised of the same letters as Bechor, which means firstborn or blessing. And you take a look at the 3 letters that comprise them. You have Bet, which we just established is the number 2. You have the letter Resh, which is one of the final 3 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and its numeric value is 200. Then you have the letter Kaf, which comes right after the Yud, and Kaf is 20. So what do 220, or combined together 222, what's the special detail in that word and in that sequence, as I kind of alluded to earlier? Well, 2 is 1 doubled. 200 is 100 doubled. And then, of course, 20 is 10 doubled. Anybody who knows a lot of the Bible history and a lot of practices within the family, they would know that whoever would have that Bechorah, or the Bechor, they would have that firstborn blessing, meaning that they would have a double portion. And you see here with the letters that comprise firstborn and the letters that comprise blessing, 2, 20, 200. They're all a doubling. And to me, that's really an example of what a relationship with God is supposed to be. There's blessing and partnership and being one with God. So in my opinion, a neat and almost secret message nestled in the veil of translation, stuff like that that's always staring at us straight in the face. And to me, that's the beauty about being able to study Scripture, especially outside of just the English language. There's so much that is staring us in the face that is a blessing to behold and blessing to stumble upon. You know, the book of Proverbs says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's the glory of kings to reveal a matter. You listen to a lot of teachers and a lot of sages of ancient Israel. They'll say that God's playing a version of hide and seek within the text, and we're being rewarded for seeing what we could find. And so there are things that we'll find revealed in the life of Joseph that are micro stages or platforms that help showcase an early example and expectancy of what we are to find in the Messiah, of course, Jesus. And really, Genesis 39 is really no different in that type of context and outlook. There are several details here that I believe kind of reveal some information for us that you'd be able to find kind of as thematic and type of the Gospels. It's not as quite as dynamic as I would say Genesis 37. Again, I think that's my favorite chapter to teach out of the entire Old Testament when kind of bringing forth the Gospels and bringing forth New Testament and Old Testament and showing where the new is concealed and the old is revealed with the other. But I want us to go ahead and take a look at Genesis 39, some of the things that are hidden in text. And here we're going to take a look at the meaning of, as I like to do, in the names of people, the names of places, because there's always so much more than what meets the eye when it comes to the study. So we're going to do a little bit of stop-go as we go through this chapter. Genesis 39 verse 1 says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt." If you look at this word in Hebrew, that is Egypt, it's Mizraim. And if you go back earlier on in Genesis, that's actually the name of the founder of Egypt there. And the word Mizraim, what it comes from, its etymology, it literally means to siege or bind, a place of restraint. And it's the same picture that you find really is a picture of a baby in the womb. And one of the most beautiful pictures I've ever had painted for me about the next book of the Bible, that being Exodus, and their departure from the land, was really that God was birthing Israel as a nation. You have three clusters of 3 plagues, and they actually liken them, the sages do, as trimesters. You actually find water being connected with the clusters in kind of a way that helps set them as being 3 sets of 3. After that's done, you have what is the 10th plague, which is the plague of the firstborn. And afterwards, there'd be water broken. You see them come to the sea splits, and the water's broken in life. Israel passes through being freed from that bondage and God delivering them to be a nation to Him. And the seed that started it all, or the conception, if you will, is all the way back in the betrayal in Genesis 37. And this story here in 39, Genesis 39 kind of advances this. And so when they go to Egypt, anytime that you read Egypt, really think of bondage, think of restriction, because that's really kind of what it was, especially as time goes forward. And it says, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Going back to the concept of this being a story of, I bet you're wondering how I got here. How did this all happen? You take a look at the life of Joseph. It is very purposeful that whenever you hear of the Essenes and they have in their eschatology or in their end times and some of their doctrinal beliefs, they have this idea of 2 messiahs. One of them is the Messiah, son of Joseph, which is a Messiah that's going to suffer setback and rejection from his brothers. And instead of him being launched forward, it's going to look like he's going to be beaten back down. You take a look at the life of Christ, and there's no coincidence in my mind that people had assumed his father to be Joseph himself. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting point. And it says the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. You see some of the things he's already been through. A lot of people wouldn't determine that as a success or the result of being a godly individual or a godly life. Sometimes setbacks are a part of what propels you forward. You can't cast arrows forward if you don't draw the bowstring. Verse 3, and it says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of the house, and all that he had was put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of the house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread that he ate. I think there's a big detail that's looked at here. I want us to examine, what does Joseph's name mean? Well, it means added to. And I think it's interesting that once Joseph was added to the household of Potiphar, it talks about how everything just absolutely flourished. And it didn't really matter what the stage was. If he was inside, everything that he was touching turned to gold. When he was outside, everything seemed to blossom and prosper. And it goes back to that idea of the concept of blessing, meaning that you're partnered with God and you're allowing yourself to be used by God. Even in a situation, paint by number, Joseph would consider this as something very much less than ideal, but that's just part of what life is, having to go through the drudges and having to go through the things that they're not preferred, they're not liked, but there's the outlook of God's going to use me as long as I'm willing to submit myself to him. And I love this detail here in verse 6. It says, thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread that he ate. If you have an Art Scroll commentary on the book of Bereshit or Genesis, it says literally, and he didn't know with him anything, meaning that of Potiphar. The only thing that he knew was the bread that he ate. And I heard a really good teaching on this back, 2017, 2018, that talked about how this is a perfect template of us living under the submission of Christ, living with Christ, meaning that you allow Jesus to be Lord of all. There's going to be blessing that's going to be outpoured. That's just going to be a natural byproduct of who Christ is in your life and what's going to happen. He said there might be things that take place and things that happen, and it's all going to be under Jesus' reign. But it is still left up to you, and it is still left up to me about what kind of bread we eat. And what is that even supposed to mean? That means the things that you take into yourself, the things that you take into your life. Yes, things for physical nourishment, but it also means the things that you feast not just your stomach on, but your eyes, your ears, your mind. Christ can have control of everything in your life, but it is still up to us and our responsibility to see what our mind feeds on. It is still under our realm to see what we physically bring into ourselves. And there's things that you can bring into your body for nourishment, and there's things that you can bring in your body that are very much less than ideal that will bring on consequences. And the rest of verse 6 says, now that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There's no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I love the way that everything was staged there, and it was really showing, and I really think Genesis 39 speaks a lot to the integrity of Joseph. He got to a point where if Potiphar really trusted Joseph, and he didn't concern himself with anything but what he had to eat for the day, whatever he's packing for lunch, he didn't know anything. Everything was up to Joseph. That is how much trust that this man had to his servant. And so really I feel like this really speaks to the integrity of Joseph and the character of Joseph and what was proven of Joseph to not just all of his peers, but those who were above him with Potiphar. And I kind of feel like whenever we read what's about to take place and what happens, I think that was just a result of her being spurned. But we'll get to that. But I want us to take a look from verse 7 to verse 10 that we just read. I think a big theme about this really could be considered temptation and opportunity. Now, if you take a look at Joseph's rise in Egypt, and whenever all of this had taken place, his rise that he had up to this point and the rise that he's going to have even afterwards, this was going to be something, it never would have taken place had he not been a man of integrity. And how many leaders that you can think back on, whether they're within the churchdom, whether they're just in political government, even if they're just characters in scriptures and many of the narratives that we read, how many characters fall short because of temptation? And myself notwithstanding, not everybody's temptation is going to be the same. But obviously the actions can be destructive, and some more so than others. I mean, he is pretty much the highest in this whole house. Anything and everything that Potiphar owned, basically, he's one signature shy of being the absolute top dog, and that being Potiphar. And it's almost like in later narrative when he has the signet ring. He has everything. Everything is under his control. We even find King David in a not really all that different situation whenever he's king of Israel. Whereas here, Joseph's just one shy of the household of being the top dog. I really feel like if he would have went along with Potiphar's wife and what she was asking him to go along with, she probably would have kept it under wrap and key. But again, going back to the fact that he resisted that temptation, or he resisted that opportunity. If you take a look at a lot of the extra biblical and Jewish writings, Joseph's time here in Egypt, whenever he was betrayed by his brethren, he was only 17 years old. And I think by the time he comes back to face with his brothers, it's only been like a 22-year span, if even that long. So you're talking about him being a teenager to him being in his 30s, while majority of this narrative and this drama takes place. So you kind of look at that, it's going to be different. And it makes me think of, too, Jesus whenever he was in the wilderness. He was very much tempted when it talks about how the devil came and tempted him, turn the rocks into bread and reveal yourself. If it was something that was a temptation, that would have been something that could have been beneficial, and it could have been something that he wanted. Jesus had the opportunity. It talks about Satan when he was saying that, cast yourself down and do this and worship me and I'll give you a kingdom. He was trying to give him a crown, which wouldn't involve Jesus having the cross either. But he didn't succumb to the temptation. He resisted it. He knew Scripture well enough where he was quoting it back to him even when he was having Scripture quoted to him. And I feel it's important for us to realize here too that Joseph, he had his opportunities, and it very much might have been a temptation for him. But he recognized that if he were to do this thing, not only would he be sinning against his master, that being Potiphar, but even as it says in verse 9, he'd be sinning against God. Let's go back to verse 10. It says, "So it was as he spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, that none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment and said, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside." It kind of makes you wonder if this is going to be a bit of a deja vu moment for Joseph, because what happened in Genesis 37? Well, yeah, he's being stripped of his garment. He's being stripped of his clothes. And here we see this deja vu moment yet again where he's resisting this temptation. He's resisting this opportunity to transgress. And what did it do? In another essence, this is going to cause yet another fall. Verse 13. "And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, 'See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. And he came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened that when he heard that I lifted up my voice to cry out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept the garment with her until the master had come home. Then she spoke to him with the words like these, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came into me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted up my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside." And I want us to take a look at this verse. It says, "So it was when his master heard the words in which his wife had spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused." Now, when it says here that the anger was aroused, to whom was this anger aroused? And what I mean is, this is somebody who's brought in as a slave, as a servant, and now the accusation's been thrown down that he's accosted his master's wife. What would the punishment have been for that? Do you think that would have been something that would have been taken lighthearted if that was truly something that was believed? Keep in mind this whole idea of Joseph and him being in the position that he was. He was put in elevation because he was seen as being a man of integrity. And that's not saying that good men don't fall, because absolutely they do. But if that was something that would have really full-heartedly been believed, I don't think Joseph would have made it out of this situation with his life intact. And when it says in this verse that the master's anger was aroused, it might have been towards his wife. Now, who knows? That's kind of a speculation. That's one of those reading between the lines and seeing this. But for him to be cast into prison, especially a royal prison at that, that's not common etiquette. That's not a common fall. But with him being blessed by God, we kind of see some of the things being orchestrated. And this was something that she, as an enemy towards him, would have meant for harm, but God used this opportunity as good. We see this almost verbatim being used later in the book of Genesis with the brethren. We also see it later on, I believe, like in the book of Isaiah as well. But some things that are meant as harm sometimes become the greatest catapult and the greatest catalyst for blessing, and not just to ourselves, to so many other people. And sometimes suffering is involved. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Growing pains aren't something many people enjoy when they're in their right mind. But with the understanding that growing pains bring us to greater heights, it's something we can endure. And especially if that blessing is going to be extended to others. And in this case of Joseph, had Joseph not gone through the fall with his brothers, had Joseph not had the betrayal of Potiphar's wife, and some of the things that we're going to find later on, think about what adverse effects would have happened. There wouldn't have been somebody or anybody in the kingdom that would have been able to do the storage program that we're going to read about that's going to save the lives of so many. Verse 20. Then Joseph's master took him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and shown him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hands all of the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper. And so, in review, wrapping this up, I want us to take a look at the predicament that Joseph was in. If we were to be taking a look at his life from his front porch and kind of witnessing everything going down as a bystander, again, we wouldn't think that this would be indicative of someone attempting a godly or even righteous life. Very oftentimes somebody winds up landing themselves in a bad situation. A lot of people kind of keep it to themselves, hush, hush, that, what they had to have done something. It's almost like the Job effect. All of us wouldn't be going down, all of us wouldn't be happening, had they not done something to deserve it. But I want us to take a look at Joseph's life all through the rest of Genesis. And I want for us to realize that Joseph is set to be an ancient preserved example of someone who would be a righteous individual, forsaken and wanted dead by many of his brethren. One thing in Genesis, you don't really see a lot of faults of Joseph talked about at all. When he was 17, he was younger, and being a teenager, yeah, he might have lacked a bunch of tact. Who at a teenage age was a perfect individual having complete perfect bedside manner, you know? But the idea that a righteous one would suffer, and by the suffering of this righteous individual would bring about salvation or deliverance to the world, this is a stage that was not created, as a lot of people would say, by Christianity itself, meaning that it was an invention of the first century. Again, Joseph is a preserved example of something that happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before. That it would be the stage, it would be the framework, something we could point to see, hey, this is kind of a familiar story. That one would suffer for all and be elevated above all but one name. And taking a look at that, we've already read the Genesis account in 37, that Judah himself was the individual who had the idea to sell off his brother for money. That amount of money was literally the equal amount for a pair of shoes. So, if he's dead, he's nobody good, but if we sell him off, we could get a pair of shoes out of it. Just one single pair of shoes, which to me is an absolutely crazy idea, especially in light of the fact that whenever we have the name Judas in the New Testament, that name Judas is the same exact name as Judah. You just put it to the ringers of Greek, some Vulgate translations, obviously the Latin. They have a masculine S ending, so Judah would become Judas. So very much of the fact of what we find in these Greek scriptures, the New Testament, you can find it all jam-packed all the way back in the Old Testament. Everything that you find in the Old Testament and you unpack it and give it air to breathe, you find played out in the stage work of the New Testament. They're not polar opposites of one another, as seemingly been the common teaching. These two things help point to one another in so many ways. I've used the example before of the plays of Shakespeare. Everybody talks about how eloquent they are and how great, not just the scripting is, but whenever you get really, really good actors involved in it, it's something to behold. These plays aren't going to be nothing if there's not framework and stage work for them to be enacted out upon. And so keep that in mind as we go through. And something else I want to mention that we keep in mind, Potiphar only knowing his bread. That to me still shows us that there remains a personal responsibility of what we bring into ourselves. Not just bread, not just our packed lunch, as I was joking earlier on today, but literally things that we digest, that we absorb into our hearts, that we absorb into our minds, that we absorb into our ears. All of it is something that we have to filter. Some of the things that we have to think, is this really going to be beneficial for me to really engage with? And one last thing as a reminder, I have already recorded an episode for Genesis chapter 40 that actually jumps into what happens while Joseph is in the prison. He encounters the royal officials, so to speak, the cupbearer. You have the baker, the people who were actually pretty close to Pharaoh. And what happened with them, like I said, check it out. It is titled Bread, Wine, and Dreams. Again, chapter 40. It's not my absolute favorite chapter in Genesis to jump into. I think that honor is reserved for chapter 37. But it is interesting as we get past this time of Passover and recording and Easter. You have the cupbearer, who obviously would be an imagery of wine. And then you have the one who was put to death, the one that was the baker. Reminds me of Jesus whenever he was having the Last Supper and having the last meal with the disciples. He takes the bread and says, "This is my body, this is my flesh." And what was put to death? It was the flesh. So again, all these things to consider. What's in Genesis that is framework and structure, and in a lot of ways blueprint of what we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and beyond. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you found some of this information engaging. And like I've always said, feel more than welcome to share this material with individuals, with your classes or conversations. That's what these are for. So again, thank you so much. Be blessed. Have a good one.